Most people think mental toughness is about how much pain you can take, how much stress you can absorb, how silent you can stay, how long you can keep functioning while something inside you is quietly wearing down. But that is not strength. That is often just survival with a polished face. And this is where so many people misunderstand the subject. They look at someone composed under pressure, disciplined in difficulty, steady in uncertainty, and assume that person was simply born stronger, less emotional, less affected, more naturally resilient. But what they are seeing on the surface is rarely the whole truth. Because strong minds do not stay intact because life is easier for them. They stay intact because they do not relate to difficulty the way fragile minds do. That difference is psychological before it is behavioral. A weak mind is not always a low-intelligence mind. It is not always a lazy mind. And it is certainly not always a mind that lacks ambition. Very often, it is simply a mind with no stable relationship to discomfort. A mind that interprets pressure as danger, uncertainty as defeat, emotion as command, and pain as proof that something has gone wrong. So the moment life becomes heavy, the inner world begins to turn against itself. Thoughts become exaggerated. Emotion becomes authority. Setbacks become identity. Temporary pain becomes permanent meaning. And people call that breaking. But breaking rarely happens all at once. It happens in smaller psychological fractures. In the moment you lose perspective. In the moment you start obeying fear. In the moment discomfort begins to define reality. In the moment you stop standing inside your own mind and start being dragged by it. That is why mental toughness is not hardness. It is structure. It is the ability to remain inwardly organized when life becomes difficult, to feel pressure without surrendering your judgment, to experience emotion without becoming ruled by it, to face uncertainty without collapsing into helplessness. Strong minds are not unfeeling. They are trained. They have built a way of seeing, interpreting, and carrying difficulty that prevents pain from becoming chaos. That which breaks most people is often not pressure, but interpretation. A strong mind does not deny pain. It refuses to kneel to it. Mental toughness begins the moment discomfort stops deciding who you become. This is why the psychology matters. Because if mental toughness were just a personality trait, then very little could be changed. But if it is built through perception, meaning, emotional regulation, and inner discipline, then strength is not reserved for the lucky few. It becomes something deeper than temperament, something trainable, something earned. And once you understand why strong minds do not break easily, you stop admiring resilience from a distance. You begin to see how it is made. Chapter 1. What it feels like when the mind gives way. Most people imagine mental breaking as a dramatic event. A visible collapse, a final snapping point, a moment so intense and unmistakable that anyone could point to it and say, that was when the mind gave way. But that is rarely how it begins. In reality, most people do not break all at once. They begin eroding quietly. The change is subtle at first. Their thinking becomes slightly faster but not yet clearly irrational. Their emotional threshold lowers but not enough to alarm them. Their inner space narrows, their patience thins, their interpretations harden, and their ability to hold perspective weakens by degrees. Nothing looks catastrophic yet, but the structure is already starting to strain. That is why mental breaking often feels confusing when it finally becomes visible. The person thinks this came out of nowhere. It usually did not. What looked sudden from the outside was often gradual from the inside. The problem is that people are not taught to notice early erosion. They only recognize the breakdown once the symptoms become loud enough to interrupt life. They notice the panic attack, not the weeks of silent acceleration before it. They notice the angry outburst, not the days of inner crowding that made them easier to trigger. They notice the moment they freeze, spiral, or emotionally shut down, but not the repeated small losses of proportion that came first. This matters because what you fail to detect early, you are forced to suffer later at greater intensity. A mind rarely goes from strong to shattered in one movement. It usually passes through smaller forms of weakening first. Clarity becomes more fragile. Emotion becomes more persuasive. Pressure starts affecting identity, not just mood. The mind becomes easier to rush, easier to flood, easier to overtake. And because each shift seems manageable in isolation, the person often keeps moving as if nothing serious is happening. He tells himself he is just tired, just stressed, just having a difficult week. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes those explanations hide a deeper reality. The mind is slowly becoming less able to absorb pressure without losing form. Think about a wall with cracks forming underneath the paint. From a distance, it still looks solid. The shape remains. The surface still holds, but pressure reveals what appearances conceal. The problem did not begin when the wall became visibly damaged. It began when the structure first stopped holding in the same way. The mind is no different. Breaking rarely starts in one big moment because the mind usually weakens before it visibly fails. It loses margin. It loses steadiness. It loses the quiet internal spacing that keeps one difficult moment from becoming a total event. By the time the collapse becomes obvious, the groundwork has often already been laid. That is why this conversation has to begin earlier than most people think. Not at the dramatic ending, at the subtle beginning. Because mental toughness is not only about surviving the visible breaking point. It is also about recognizing the quieter moments when the mind first begins giving away its structure, long before it finally gives way. Mental strain has a texture that many people live inside without knowing how to describe. That is part of what makes it so exhausting. When the mind is under real pressure, the experience is not only that life feels hard, it is that the inside of your own thinking starts feeling less livable. The mind becomes louder, tighter, faster, and less spacious all at once. Thoughts stop arriving with order. They begin arriving with force. One concern spills into another. One uncertainty starts touching everything. The whole inner field becomes more crowded, and the person inside it begins losing room to think well. This is usually where strain becomes frightening. Not because the person has already collapsed, but because he can feel his own structure beginning to thin. Perspective narrows. Emotion rises. Interpretation speeds up. And what might have remained one hard moment begins taking on the feel of a total event. That is the inner texture of a mind under strain, compression. Time feels more urgent. Problems feel closer. Consequences feel heavier. Options feel fewer. The future becomes easier to darken and harder to hold with proportion. Even small variables can begin feeling unusually charged. A delayed reply, a tense expression, an unfinished task, an uncertain outcome. Things that might normally be handled with perspective begin arriving inside the mind with exaggerated force. The person is no longer only facing difficulty. He is facing difficulty through a system that has started shrinking its own breathing room. And once that happens, a second shift usually follows. The mind stops sorting well. When mental space is intact, you can distinguish between what is serious and what is simply uncomfortable. You can tell the difference between urgency and importance, fear and fact, discomfort and danger. But strain weakens that sorting function. Everything begins moving toward the same emotional level. Many things feel pressing at once. The mind flattens hierarchy. It starts treating multiple concerns as equally immediate, equally threatening, equally deserving of full internal attention. That is why mentally strained people often feel overwhelmed, even before anything objectively catastrophic has happened. Their inner world has lost distinction. Then comes self-reaction. The person notices he is getting more reactive, more restless, more mentally flooded, and instead of simply noticing it, he often begins reacting to that too. Now there is the original pressure, and there is the pressure of feeling himself under pressure. He becomes frustrated by his own speed, ashamed of his own fragility, suspicious of his own mind. This makes the internal field even more crowded. The strain is no longer just environmental, it has become relational. The person is now under tension with his own mental state. That is why the experience feels so dense. A mind under strain is not merely busy. It is compressed, emotionally persuasive, interpretively narrowed, and increasingly easy to overrun. And until someone learns to recognize that texture clearly, he will keep mistaking it for reality in its final form. But naming it matters, because once you can say, "This is what strain feels like inside me," you are no longer only lost in it. You are beginning to see its shape. A difficult moment does not end when the moment ends. Part of it stays behind. That is what many people fail to see when they think about mental strain. They assume the real damage happens only inside the stressful event itself. The panic, the shutdown, the overreaction, the freezing, the loss of perspective, the emotional flooding. But what often shapes a person most deeply is not only what happened during the pressure. It is what the mind learned from that pressure afterward. Because every time you break under strain, your mind records something. Not always in words, often in expectation. It starts building a quieter conclusion about who you become when life gets heavy. It notices how quickly your thinking loses form. It notices how easily urgency takes over. It notices whether fear becomes command, whether emotion becomes total reality, whether structure disappears the moment pressure rises beyond a certain point. And the more often that pattern repeats, the less neutral the mind becomes in future moments of stress. This is how fragility becomes self-reinforcing. A person does not just suffer one difficult episode and move on untouched. He begins carrying memory into the next one. He remembers the last spiral, the last overreaction, the last moment he lost proportion, the last time his inner world became smaller, louder, and harder to control than he wanted. So when the next pressure comes, part of him is no longer only dealing with the event in front of him. He is also dealing with his own history inside events like it. That matters enormously, because self-trust is built or weakened by repeated internal evidence. If your mind keeps watching itself collapse under pressure, it starts lowering its expectations of its own steadiness. It becomes more cautious around challenge, more suspicious of its own capacity, more likely to interpret stress as the beginning of another internal failure rather than simply another moment requiring skill. The person may still be intelligent, capable, and outwardly functioning, but inwardly something has changed. He no longer fully believes that he can remain himself when life becomes demanding. That is a painful way to live. Not only because pressure feels hard, because you start fearing what pressure will turn you into. You stop entering difficult moments with innocence. You carry anticipation. You brace against your own mind. You do not merely wonder what will happen. You wonder what you will become inside what happens. Will I stay clear? Will I lose proportion again? Will I spiral the same way? Will I make this bigger than it is? Will I abandon all the inner work I thought I had done? These questions may not always be spoken aloud, but they shape a person powerfully. This is where mental strain becomes an identity issue, not just a temporary experience. Because the mind is always learning from repeated patterns. If under pressure, you repeatedly become reactive, panicked, helpless, or mentally scattered, then a part of the mind begins organizing itself around that expectation. It starts assuming that difficulty and disorganization belong together, that pressure and self-loss are linked, that intensity means collapse is near. Over time, this expectation can become so familiar that it feels like personality rather than conditioning. That is why people start saying things like, "I'm just not good under pressure," or "This is what happens to me when things get intense," or "I always fall apart when too much hits me at once." Those sentences sound observational, but they are often learned conclusions built from repeated evidence. And the more deeply those conclusions settle in, the more pressure begins with a hidden disadvantage. The mind is no longer meeting the moment fresh. It is meeting it with a story already forming in the background, a story about weakness, a story about instability, a story about what kind of person you supposedly are when life stops being easy. This is why every break matters. Not because one difficult response ruins you, not because one bad day defines your whole mind, but because repeated breaks, if left uninterpreted, begin teaching the mind a dangerous lesson. That pressure has the right to reorganize you. That lesson weakens internal credibility. And once internal credibility weakens, many things become harder. Decision-making becomes more hesitant. Challenge feels more threatening. Self-respect becomes less stable. Confidence becomes more performative and less earned. The mind becomes a place you can function with, but not fully trust under load. That gap between outward capability and inward trust is one of the quietest forms of suffering many people carry. So this section has to make one thing clear. Mental toughness is not only about handling pressure better in the moment. It is also about protecting what your mind learns from the moment. Because every pressured response is teaching something. It is shaping expectation. It is training identity. It is influencing what the mind will assume next time life becomes heavy. And if you want a strong mind, you cannot ignore that deeper layer. You have to understand that repeated collapse does not just create bad memories. It creates internal predictions. The good news is that this process works in both directions. If the mind can learn fragility through repeated evidence, it can also learn steadiness through repeated evidence. It can learn that pressure does not always end in self-loss. It can learn that strain can be felt without becoming total. It can learn that difficult moments do not automatically erase structure, but that rebuilding begins with honesty. It begins with seeing that the issue is larger than one stressful event here and there. Each time you break, your mind learns something. So the real question is no longer only, how do I survive pressure? It becomes, what am I teaching my mind about itself every time pressure arrives? Chapter 2, Why Some Minds Break Faster Than Others. One of the easiest mistakes people make when thinking about mental toughness is assuming that if the pressure is intense enough, collapse is simply inevitable. They tell themselves, of course I broke. Look at what I was carrying. Look at what was happening. Look at the weight, the uncertainty, the stress, the exhaustion, the emotional load. And to be fair, much of that may be true. Hardship is real. Some seasons are genuinely heavy. Some situations do place more strain on the mind than most people admit. Any serious conversation about mental toughness has to begin there, because false toughness always starts by pretending life is easier than it is. But that is only part of the truth. Hardship is real. Collapse still has a structure. That distinction matters because if you believe difficulty alone explains everything, then mental breaking starts to feel like a fixed consequence of circumstance. It feels as though the outer event contains the whole explanation. Life got too hard, so the mind gave way. Pressure increased, so breakdown followed. End of story. But that is not the full story. If external difficulty alone determined collapse, then every person under the same pressure would break in the same way. They do not. Some people feel the strain deeply and still remain usable inside it. They may not feel calm. They may not enjoy the experience. They may not perform perfectly, but they do not lose proportion in the same way. They do not become as mentally overrun. They do not let stress reorganize their whole inner world as quickly. That does not make them superhuman. It means something inside their psychology is different. Something structural is carrying part of the load. And that is exactly the point. The event matters. The inner structure, meeting the event, matters too. This is where many people become either too harsh or too helpless with themselves. They become too harsh when they say, If I were stronger, none of this would affect me. They become too helpless when they say, anyone would collapse in my situation, so there is nothing meaningful to build. Both positions distort reality. One denies the legitimacy of pain. The other denies the possibility of training. A more accurate and useful truth sits between them. Life may be hard, but collapse is shaped by what kind of mind that hardship enters. That means the mind is not only reacting to difficulty, it is participating in the final shape of the experience, through interpretation, through emotional containment, through inner rules, through the ability or inability to preserve proportion, through what pressure is allowed to mean and how quickly meaning hardens under strain. This is why two people can face similar difficulty and still live through it very differently. One mind meets stress and immediately speeds up. It interprets too quickly, darkens the future, personalizes uncertainty, and lets urgency become command. Another mind may still feel the same surge, but it slows meaning, keeps some distance from fear, and protects enough internal order that the pressure does not become total. The circumstance may still be painful for both, but the structure underneath changes how destructively that pain moves through the system. That is what it means to say collapse has a structure. It means that when a mind breaks, it is usually not only because life was difficult. It is because difficulty entered a system with certain vulnerabilities already in place. Maybe the mind fuses too quickly with emotion. Maybe it lacks strong inner rules. Maybe it catastrophizes uncertainty. Maybe it treats discomfort as danger. Maybe it has too little internal space between feeling and conclusion. Maybe it has learned to abandon structure whenever pressure rises beyond a certain point. These vulnerabilities do not make a person weak in some permanent moral sense, but they do make the mind easier to destabilize. They act like hidden fault lines, and when hardship arrives, those fault lines matter. This should not be heard as blame. It should be heard as precision. Blame says, you should have handled it better. Precision says, there is more here than circumstance, which means there is something real to understand and build. That is a much stronger position. Because if difficulty were the whole explanation, then your only hope would be easier conditions. But if collapse has a structure, then growth becomes possible even before life becomes easier. You can strengthen interpretation. You can build emotional containment. You can develop inner standards. You can stop letting pressure rewrite everything so quickly. You can train the mind to remain more intact inside hard moments, not because hardship becomes unreal, but because the structure meeting hardship becomes stronger. This is one of the deepest psychological shifts in mental toughness. You stop asking only, why is life so heavy? And start asking, what inside me is making this heaviness more likely to become collapse? That question is not cruel. It is empowering, because it turns pressure into information. It turns suffering into diagnosis. It turns vague fragility into a set of buildable psychological realities. And that is how toughness actually begins. Not by denying pain, not by glorifying struggle, but by seeing clearly that while hardship is real, the way the mind breaks under hardship is never only an accident of circumstance. It has a structure, and whatever has a structure can, with enough honesty and training, be rebuilt. One of the central reasons some minds break faster than others is not simply that they feel more. It is that they lose distance from what they feel. That distinction matters enormously, because pressure does not become mentally destructive only when emotion rises. Emotion is natural, fear is natural, stress is natural, urgency is natural. A strong mind still feels all of these things. The real danger begins when feeling stops being one part of experience and starts becoming the whole frame through which experience is interpreted. That is when the mind becomes easiest to destabilize. This is what happens when feeling becomes the whole reality. A person does not merely feel fear. He starts seeing through fear. He does not merely feel overwhelmed. He begins interpreting everything through overwhelm. He does not merely feel urgency. He gives urgency authority over thought, language, and behavior. At that point, the emotion is no longer a state moving through the mind. It has become the atmosphere governing the mind. And once that happens, clarity weakens quickly. Because when emotion becomes total, it stops being information and starts behaving like truth. Fear sounds like fact. Stress sounds like prediction. Emotional pain sounds like evidence. The mind no longer says, "I am feeling a powerful state right now." It begins saying, consciously or not, "This feeling is showing me what reality is." That shift is one of the most dangerous psychological movements under pressure, because it fuses the inner experience with the outer meaning. This is why emotionally flooded people often sound so convincing to themselves in the moment. Their conclusions do not feel like guesses. They feel like reality revealed. If the fear is strong enough, danger feels certain. If the pressure is high enough, collapse feels inevitable. If the emotion is intense enough, the mind stops questioning its own frame. It obeys what it feels because what it feels has become indistinguishable from what it believes is true. That is emotional fusion. And emotional fusion is one of the quietest enemies of mental toughness. Because once fusion takes hold, the mind loses its ability to stand slightly apart from its own state. It stops observing and starts becoming. It stops holding emotion and starts being organized by emotion. It stops treating the inner surge as something to contain and begins letting that surge rewrite perspective, proportion, and response. The person is no longer just under pressure. He is being mentally governed by the feeling pressure created. Imagine someone waiting for a difficult outcome, entering conflict, facing public exposure, carrying financial uncertainty, or confronting a painful mistake. If feeling becomes the whole reality, the mind quickly turns one hard situation into a total internal environment. The body tightens, the thoughts speed up, the emotional tone darkens, and suddenly the entire field of perception begins shrinking around the pressure. Silence starts meaning danger. Delay starts meaning failure. Discomfort starts meaning something is already going wrong at a much larger level than may actually be true. This is why emotional fusion is so destabilizing. It removes distinction. It removes hierarchy. It removes interpretive space. And without space, the mind becomes easier to overwhelm. A person who has no distance from his own state becomes highly vulnerable under pressure because every strong feeling gains the power to reorganize the whole system. A difficult moment no longer remains one part of experience. It spreads. It takes over tone, meaning, memory, expectation, and self-relationship all at once. That is why some people do not simply feel bad under stress. They become mentally unrecognizable to themselves inside it. Their mind loses form because feeling has become the entire lens. This is the deeper issue. Not emotional depth, not sensitivity, not the fact that the person feels strongly. The issue is whether feeling instantly becomes law inside the mind. That is what strong minds do differently. They still feel, sometimes very deeply, but they do not surrender the whole interpretive field to the feeling. They preserve a little separation, a little internal space, enough to say this fear is real, but it is not the whole truth. This urgency is loud, but it does not get to define everything. This overwhelm is present, but it is not the final meaning of the situation. That small distance changes everything. Because once there is distance, there is choice. Once there is distance, there is observation. Once there is distance, feeling can remain intense without becoming absolute. This is not emotional suppression. It is emotional adulthood. It is the ability to let a state exist without letting that state seize total command of interpretation. It is the refusal to let intensity become authority just because it is intense. And that refusal is one of the foundations of mental toughness, because strong minds do not stay strong by feeling less. They stay stronger by not letting every powerful feeling become the whole reality. So this is the hard but liberating question. When pressure rises, do you merely feel it, or do you start living inside it as though it is the full truth of everything? The more honestly you can answer that, the more clearly you can see why some minds break under strain. They do not only feel deeply, they lose the distance that would have kept deep feeling from becoming total reality. Pressure does not only test how much emotion you can feel, it tests what inside you has already been settled. That is why some minds become so easy to shake, not because they are unintelligent, not because they care too much, not because life is always harder for them than for everyone else, but because when pressure arrives, too much inside remains negotiable. Their interpretation becomes negotiable. Their behavior becomes negotiable. Their standards become negotiable. Their relationship with discomfort becomes negotiable. And once everything is open to negotiation, pressure takes command very quickly. This is the hidden weakness of a mind without inner rules. It has no firm place to stand when emotion rises. In calm moments, this may not look like a problem. A person may seem flexible, thoughtful, emotionally aware, even mature. He may be able to move through ordinary life well enough because ordinary life does not force his internal structure to declare itself. But pressure changes that. Pressure asks immediate questions. What does this mean? What are you going to do? What is allowed to happen inside you right now? And if there are no settled inner rules, the loudest feeling in the moment begins answering all of those questions. That is when the mind becomes unstable. Fear starts deciding meaning. Urgency starts deciding pace. Discomfort starts deciding behavior. Overwhelm starts deciding identity. Nothing inside has enough authority to interrupt the emotional momentum, so the whole system bends toward whatever state is strongest. The person does not only feel pressured, he becomes governable by pressure. This is why inner rules matter so much. Not as slogans, not as fake affirmations, not as decorative ideas you repeat when life is easy, as internal laws that remain meaningful when life is not easy. An inner rule is something like this: not every intense feeling is true, not every urgent thought deserves obedience, not every uncomfortable moment requires collapse, not every difficult season gives fear the right to rewrite my whole mind. These rules sound simple, but under pressure they become structural. They give the mind something firmer than emotion to return to. They reduce how much the moment is allowed to redefine. That is what strong minds have that weaker minds often lack. They have predecided truths. They do not invent themselves in the middle of the storm. They return to what has already been settled. Imagine someone facing criticism, conflict, uncertainty, or bad news. If he has no inner rules, the moment becomes psychologically expensive very quickly. He must negotiate everything in real time. Is this a disaster? Should I panic? Does this mean I am failing? Do I abandon my standards now because the pressure feels high enough? But if he has inner rules, the same pressure still affects him, yet it meets resistance. The emotion arrives. But it does not enter an empty field. It enters a mind with principles already in place. That difference is enormous, because mental toughness is not only emotional endurance. It is interpretive discipline. It is behavioral steadiness. It is the presence of inner rules strong enough that pressure cannot instantly rewrite the whole system. So if your mind breaks too easily, one question matters: what inside me has already been decided, and what still gets handed over to emotion every time life becomes hard? The answer to that question reveals a great deal. A mind without inner rules has nothing stable to stand on. A mind with them may still feel the storm, but it does not immediately become the storm. Chapter 3. Mental toughness is usually misunderstood. One of the biggest misunderstandings about mental toughness is that people think strong minds must feel less. Less fear, less pain, less pressure, less emotional disturbance when life becomes difficult. And because that idea sounds believable on the surface, many people quietly begin chasing the wrong kind of strength. They assume that if they could just become harder, colder, more detached, more unaffected, then they would stop breaking so easily. They imagine toughness as emotional deadness, a sealed interior, a mind that does not get shaken because nothing gets in deeply enough to shake it. But that is not mental toughness. That is often self-protective numbness. And numbness is not the same as strength. A numb mind may look controlled from the outside. It may appear composed, flat, untouchable, even impressive in a harsh way. But very often that kind of composure is not built on real inner structure. It is built on reduction, reduced feeling, reduced contact, reduced vulnerability, reduced honesty with what is actually happening inside. The person does not collapse as visibly because he is trying not to participate as fully in life. He avoids being broken by becoming harder to reach. That strategy can create temporary relief. It can even resemble strength for a while. But it comes with a cost. Because when a person solves fragility by cutting himself off from feeling, he does not become more psychologically developed. He becomes more defended. He may feel less overwhelmed, but he also feels less alive, less connected, less perceptive, less emotionally intelligent. He gains some distance from pain, but often loses depth with it. He stops breaking as easily perhaps, but he also stops experiencing himself as fully available to life. That is not the goal of real mental toughness. A strong mind is not a mind that feels nothing. It is a mind that can feel something deeply without losing its structure. That distinction changes everything. Because once you understand it, you stop treating emotion itself as the enemy. Fear is not the enemy. Sadness is not the enemy. Stress is not the enemy. Emotional activation is not the enemy. These states are part of being human. They will visit any serious life. They will rise when stakes are real, when uncertainty stretches on, when loss enters, when conflict sharpens, when the future becomes harder to control. To feel these things does not mean the mind is weak. It means the mind is alive enough to register what matters. The issue is not whether emotion appears. The issue is what happens to the structure of the mind when emotion appears. That is where toughness lies. Not in emotional absence, in emotional containment, not in becoming untouched, in becoming less easily disorganized by what touches you. Think about the difference between two people in the same pressured moment. Both may feel fear. Both may feel a tightening in the chest, a quickening of thought, a sense of consequence. But one person begins losing form. The fear spreads into interpretation, behavior, self-relationship, and meaning. The whole mind bends around the state. The other person feels the same activation, perhaps even intensely, but does not let the activation take over every function. Something remains intact. Perspective remains more available. Behavior remains more guided. The feeling is real, but it does not become total authority. That is strength. And it is a much more mature form of strength than numbness will ever be. Because numbness protects by shrinking. Strength protects by containing. Numbness says, I will feel less so life cannot move me as much. Strength says, life may move me, but I will not let movement become collapse. Those are very different psychological positions. This matters because many people who repeatedly break under pressure become ashamed of their own sensitivity. They start thinking the problem is that they care too much, feel too much, react too deeply. So they try to harden themselves in the wrong way. They become emotionally flatter, more guarded, more detached from what they actually feel. They start admiring a version of toughness that is really just distance, but distance is not the same as resilience. Sometimes it is only avoidance dressed in a stronger tone. Real mental toughness does not require you to become less human. It requires you to become more internally structured. A strong mind can still feel hurt, still feel pressure, still feel sorrow, fear, uncertainty, tension, disappointment, and emotional weight. But it does not immediately turn those experiences into total internal takeover. It does not let one wave become the whole sea. It does not let activation erase hierarchy, proportion, and deliberate response. It keeps enough form that feeling can move through the system without becoming the full system. That is why strong minds often look quieter than people expect. Not theatrical, not aggressively stoic, not obsessed with proving how unaffected they are, just more structurally intact. They do not need to deny emotion because they are not as frightened by emotion taking command. They can let feeling be present without treating feeling as proof that the whole inner world must now reorganize around it. This is one of the most important reframes in the entire psychology of mental toughness. You do not become strong by eliminating emotion. You become strong by increasing your capacity to remain yourself while emotion is present. That is a far more useful aim. Because it means growth is not about becoming colder. It is about becoming larger inside, a larger container, a steadier interpretive frame, a stronger relationship to discomfort, a mind that does not instantly surrender its clarity just because intensity has entered the room. That kind of strength is not fake. It does not require pretending. It does not require performing invulnerability. It simply requires that emotion stop being the thing that automatically decides everything else. And once that begins happening, something very important changes. You stop judging yourself for being affected. You stop using feeling itself as evidence of weakness. You stop chasing a lifeless version of toughness that would cost you your humanity. Instead, you begin building the real thing. A mind that can stay in contact with life without being so easily broken by contact. That is why strong minds are not emotionless minds. They are minds with enough structure that emotion can arrive without becoming the ruler of the whole inner world. Most people think mental toughness means staying calm. But calm is not the real test. Calm often belongs to favorable conditions. When the stakes are low, when the timeline is generous, when the emotional temperature is manageable, many people can appear steady enough. They can think clearly, speak reasonably, and move through the situation without much visible difficulty. But that kind of calm does not always reveal strength. Sometimes it only reveals that life is not pressing hard enough yet to expose what the mind is truly built on. Stress reveals more. Because stress changes the demand placed on the system. It compresses time. It raises emotional intensity. It introduces uncertainty, consequence, and internal noise. It creates weight. And once that weight arrives, the real question is no longer whether you can look composed in comfortable conditions. The real question becomes whether you can keep your inner shape when the pressure starts pushing against it. That is what mental toughness really is. The ability to keep form under stress. That phrase matters because under pressure, people do not only feel bad, they often lose form. Their thinking loses form. Their emotional world loses form. Their attention loses form. Their behavior loses form. One problem begins contaminating everything else. One fear starts coloring every interpretation. One difficult moment starts feeling like the whole truth of reality. The mind stops holding structure and starts bending around whatever is loudest inside it. That is why so many people misunderstand their own instability. They think the issue is simply that they feel too much. But often the deeper issue is that what they feel reorganizes too much. Stress does not merely pass through them. It reshapes the whole field too quickly. It changes their pace, their meaning-making, their tone, their standards, and their sense of self-command all at once. A tougher mind still feels pressure. It still registers fear, urgency, disappointment, uncertainty, and strain. But it does not surrender its whole structure to those states. That is the difference. A strong mind under stress can still lose comfort without losing proportion. It can still feel activation without turning activation into total command. It can still experience difficulty without letting difficulty flatten everything into one emotional level. Somewhere inside, form remains. Not perfect form, not complete calm, but enough structure that the mind does not become unrecognizable to itself the moment pressure rises. Think of a building under high wind. A weak structure shakes too far, loses balance, or breaks at its stress points. A stronger structure still feels the force, but it retains its integrity. It may move, it may strain, but it holds its essential shape. That is a useful image for mental toughness. Toughness is not the absence of impact. It is retained structure during impact. This is a much better standard than trying to feel nothing. Because feeling nothing is not realistic, and it is not even desirable. But keeping form is trainable. It means preserving a few essential functions when stress arrives: proportion, interpretation, emotional containment, and behavioral direction. It means asking what is actually happening instead of instantly obeying the loudest fear. It means keeping the mind from becoming a crowded theater where every thought is urgent and every feeling sounds final. That is why mental toughness is not really about looking hard. It is about remaining organized. It is about not letting stress erase your hierarchy, your standards, or your relationship with reality. So the real question under pressure is not, am I calm enough? It is, how much of my structure remains available right now? Because that is what strong minds protect. Not comfort. Form. Most people meet pressure through preference. They want the moment to feel easier, clearer, slower, safer, more emotionally manageable. They want more certainty before they act, more reassurance before they decide, more comfort before they hold their ground. That is human. Preference is not weakness by itself. Of course, the mind prefers relief over strain, ease over uncertainty, calm over internal friction. But pressure does not ask what you would prefer. It reveals what leads you when preference is no longer available. That is why toughness begins when preference stops leading. Preference says, I could handle this better if it felt different. Toughness says, it may not feel different. How will I stand anyway? That difference is enormous. Because preference keeps the mind focused on conditions. Toughness shifts the mind toward posture inside conditions. And that shift changes everything under stress. A mind ruled by preference becomes highly vulnerable the moment reality refuses to cooperate. If the situation feels unfair, it destabilizes faster. If the uncertainty lasts longer than expected, it loses more structure. If the discomfort rises beyond what it wanted, it begins negotiating with the moment instead of meeting it. The person is not only carrying the pressure itself, he is also carrying resistance to the fact that the pressure exists in this form at all. That resistance quietly drains strength. This is where many people begin breaking earlier than they realize. They are not only affected by what is happening, they are mentally arguing with what is happening. Why does it have to be like this? Why can't this be easier? Why can't I have more time, more clarity, more emotional steadiness first? Those questions are understandable, but under real strain, they rarely build structure. They usually deepen internal disorder. They keep the mind emotionally attached to a version of reality that is not here, while the actual moment continues demanding a response. This is why posture matters more than preference. Posture is the way the mind chooses to stand inside a reality it did not choose. It is not hardness. It is not pretending to enjoy pressure. It is not emotional deadness. It is the refusal to let discomfort decide your whole inner position. A tough mind still has preferences. It would still rather have less uncertainty, less emotional friction, less weight. But it does not wait for preference to be satisfied before trying to remain in form. It understands something crucial. If you can only function well when reality flatters your preferences, then your mind will always be easier to shake than you think. Imagine two people in the same difficult moment. One keeps focusing on how much he dislikes the pressure, how unfair it feels, how badly he wants the discomfort to end before he responds well. The other feels all of that too, but asks a different question. What must I protect in myself right now? That second question is the beginning of toughness. It brings the mind back to structure, responsibility, and inner position. This is the deeper truth. Preference asks life to change first. Toughness asks the mind to stay upright even before life does. And once that becomes your posture, pressure stops being only a test of what you feel. It becomes a test of what leads you when feeling cannot be trusted to lead well. Chapter 4: The Psychological Architecture of Mental Toughness. One of the clearest differences between a fragile mind and a strong one is not what happens after pressure appears. It is what happens in the first seconds of interpretation. A weakly structured mind gives meaning too quickly. Something happens, and before the facts are fully clear, the conclusion is already forming. A delayed message becomes rejection. A mistake becomes failure. A tense conversation becomes danger. A problem becomes a catastrophe in progress. The event may be real. The pressure may be real. But the mind adds a second injury by deciding too fast what the event must mean. That speed is costly, because under pressure, fast meaning is rarely clean meaning. It is fear-colored meaning, urgency-colored meaning, fatigue-colored meaning, insecurity-colored meaning. The mind is not calmly reading reality. It is reacting from activation and calling that reaction insight. And once that first interpretation hardens, the whole inner system begins organizing around it. Emotion rises further. Behavior becomes more scattered. Thought narrows. The person is no longer responding to the event itself. He is responding to the meaning his pressure-loaded mind assigned to the event in its first rush. This is how many people quietly make difficulty heavier than it already is. Not by lacking intelligence, by letting interpretation outrun evidence. Strong minds do something different. They slow meaning before they react. That does not mean they become passive. It does not mean they deny the seriousness of what is happening. It does not mean they pretend everything is fine. It means they refuse to let the first emotional interpretation become final truth simply because it arrived first and arrived loudly. That refusal is a major part of mental toughness. Because when pressure hits, the mind wants speed. It wants to close uncertainty quickly. It wants an explanation now. It wants to know what this means, how bad it is, what danger is coming, and what conclusion should be obeyed. That craving for immediate certainty is deeply human, but it is also one of the reasons fragile minds break more easily. They rush to meaning in order to escape uncertainty, and in doing so they often create meanings far harsher than reality has yet justified. So the first discipline is simple, though not easy. Do not let urgency become a shortcut to certainty. That line matters, because urgency feels authoritative. It makes its thoughts sound important. It makes the first interpretation feel like survival-level knowledge. But urgency is not always wisdom. Often it is just activation demanding obedience. A strong mind learns to recognize that difference. It feels the rush without immediately kneeling to it. Imagine someone receiving unexpected criticism from a boss, partner, client, or family member. A fast, fragile interpretation says, "This is going badly, I've been exposed, I'm losing standing, this is bigger than it looks." In seconds, the body tightens, the emotions surge, and the meaning expands beyond the event. But a stronger mind pauses, not forever, long enough. It asks, what exactly was said? What do I actually know? What part is fact, and what part is my pressure adding weight? That pause does not erase the difficulty. It prevents difficulty from instantly becoming distortion. That is the beginning of strength. Not brilliant self-talk. Not motivational slogans. Interpretive discipline. Because mental toughness is not only about tolerating pain, it is about protecting meaning under pressure. A strong mind knows that once meaning becomes distorted, everything downstream becomes harder. Emotion becomes bigger, behavior becomes less precise, the future becomes darker, the self becomes less trustworthy, so it protects the interpretation early. It does not rush to the darkest possible reading simply because the moment feels charged. This is especially important for people who are thoughtful, sensitive, reflective, and mentally intense. Those people often do not suffer because they do not think enough. They suffer because under pressure, their thinking becomes too fast, too fused, and too convinced by its first emotional conclusions. They are not short on intelligence. They are short on spacing. And spacing is what strong minds create before reaction. That spacing may sound like this. Something happened, but I do not need to decide its full meaning yet. This feels serious, but seriousness is not the same as catastrophe. I can let the facts emerge before I let fear finalize the story. Those are not soft thoughts. They are structural thoughts. They keep the mind from becoming its own amplifier. This is why slowing meaning is not a minor skill. It is one of the first psychological mechanisms of real toughness. It protects the mind from turning pressure into a self-created mental emergency before reality has fully spoken. It trains the person to distinguish between event and interpretation, between activation and accuracy, between the first emotional draft and the deeper truth. And once a person learns this, pressure stops having quite the same power. Not because hard things become easy, because the mind becomes less eager to injure itself with premature meanings. So if you want to understand why strong minds do not break as easily, start here. They do not let the first interpretation own them. They know that the first meaning that appears under stress is often the least trustworthy one. They know that fear loves speed. They know that pressure compresses perspective. And because they know that, they slow the meaning before they react. That is not hesitation. That is toughness thinking clearly before toughness acts. One of the most important psychological skills in mental toughness is the ability to feel a state without becoming organized by that state. Most people do not realize how often they lose that distinction. They do not simply feel fear. They begin seeing through fear. They do not simply feel urgency. They begin thinking, speaking, and reacting with urgency, as though urgency itself now deserves command. They do not simply feel overwhelmed. They begin interpreting everything through overwhelm. That is the turning point. Because once a state stops being something you are experiencing and starts becoming the whole lens through which you experience reality, the mind becomes much easier to break. This is why tough minds know how to contain the state without becoming it. Containment is not suppression. It is not pretending not to feel. It is not numbing out, tightening up, or forcing yourself into an artificial calm. It is the ability to let an intense state exist inside you without handing that state full authority over interpretation, identity, and behavior. That distinction is everything. Because many people only know two ways of responding to strong emotion. They either get swallowed by it or try to crush it. They either merge with the feeling completely or wage war against it, but both responses often make the mind less stable. When you merge with the state, you lose structure. When you fight the state blindly, you often add tension to tension. Containment offers a third path. It says, this is real, this is present, but this is not the whole of me, and it is not the whole truth. That is a much stronger inner posture. Imagine a person receiving bad news, stepping into conflict, facing exposure, or carrying a problem that has not yet resolved. A wave of anxiety rises, the chest tightens, the thoughts speed up, the body signals threat. In that moment, a fragile mind quickly becomes identical with the state. Anxiety does not remain something being felt. It becomes the atmosphere of the whole system. Everything starts looking darker, closer, more dangerous, more urgent than it may actually be. The person is not only having an anxious reaction, he is now reasoning from inside anxiety as though anxiety has become reality. A tougher mind does something different. Not magically, not effortlessly, but structurally. It notices the state and refuses to let the state take over the whole field. It says, in effect, fear is here, but fear is not the only thing here. Pressure is here, but pressure does not get to become the narrator of everything. The feeling is allowed to exist, but it is not allowed to seize the whole architecture of the mind. That is containment. And it matters because pressure always tries to produce totality. It wants the state to feel absolute. It wants fear to feel final. It wants urgency to sound like wisdom. It wants emotional activation to flatten all distinctions so that everything begins feeling equally serious, equally immediate, equally charged. Containment interrupts that movement. It restores internal room. It keeps the mind from becoming entirely made of whatever it is feeling in the moment. That room is one of the deepest forms of psychological strength. Because once there is room, other faculties can remain alive. Observation can remain alive. Proportion can remain alive. Deliberateness can remain alive. Behavioral guidance can remain alive. The person may still feel shaken, but he is no longer completely governed by the shake. He may still feel intensity, but the intensity is being held inside something larger than itself. This is why strong minds are not necessarily less emotional. They are often less fusible. That is an important difference. They do not always have weaker feelings. Often they simply have a stronger container. They can hold fear without letting fear become identity. They can hold frustration without letting frustration rewrite every thought. They can hold sadness without letting sadness define the full meaning of the day. They can hold pressure without instantly becoming pressured in every dimension of mind and behavior. Think of a container and a spill. If there is no container, the liquid spreads everywhere. It reaches every surface, changes the whole environment, and creates disorder far beyond its original size. But if the container holds, the intensity stays where it belongs. It can still be strong. It can still matter, but it does not invade everything. That is what containment does for the mind. It keeps one state from spreading into the entire system. This is especially important because intense states often feel persuasive. The stronger the feeling, the more truthful it can seem. The more urgent the state, the more right it can sound. But intensity is not the same as authority. A state can be real without deserving command. A feeling can be powerful without being the final interpretation of the moment. A strong mind learns that difference and keeps relearning it under pressure. This is the practical shift. Instead of asking, "How do I make this feeling disappear?" the tougher question becomes, "How do I hold this feeling without letting it run the whole mind?" That question creates maturity. Because disappearance is not always available, but containment often is. You may not be able to stop the first wave of fear, but you may be able to stop fear from becoming your entire way of seeing. You may not be able to stop urgency from rising in the body, but you may be able to stop urgency from deciding the meaning of everything. You may not be able to prevent overwhelm from visiting, but you may be able to prevent overwhelm from becoming your identity. That is toughness in psychological form, not stiffness, not emotional deadness, not the performance of being untouched, just the increasingly reliable ability to hold a state without becoming made of it. That is why tough minds do not break as easily. It is not because no storm enters them. It is because the storm does not so quickly become the whole sky. When pressure rises, most people instinctively try to solve the problem with thought alone. They stay in their head. They analyze harder, predict faster, rehearse more intensely, and keep searching for the one mental conclusion that will restore control. At first, this feels reasonable. After all, the mind is where interpretation happens, where planning happens, where solutions are shaped. But when thought has already become accelerated, emotionally loaded, and unstable, trying to use more of it as the only rescue tool often makes the situation worse. The mind begins chasing itself. One thought leads to another, not toward clarity but toward amplification. A problem becomes a chain becomes a scenario becomes a future, and before anything external has fully changed, the person is already living inside a much larger internal event than reality may actually require. That is the danger of spiraling thought. It does not just reflect pressure, it multiplies it. This is why strong minds do not rely on thought alone when the spiral begins. They use action, not dramatic action, not frantic action, grounded action. Because under pressure, clean behavior can restore a kind of order that thought, in that moment, may no longer be capable of restoring by itself. That is an important shift. Action is not only something you do after the mind becomes stable. Sometimes action is part of how the mind becomes stable. A spiraling mind tends to lose sequence. Everything starts feeling simultaneous. Every concern wants attention at once. The person feels mentally crowded, emotionally accelerated, and increasingly detached from the simple order of what can actually be done next. This is why pressure can feel so total. The mind is no longer moving in steps. It is moving in floods. Behavior interrupts that. One clean action reintroduces sequence. Stand up. Get water. Open the file. Write down the actual problem in one sentence. Put the phone away. Send the necessary reply. Take a slow walk without feeding the story. Clear one surface. Return to one concrete task. These actions sound ordinary. That is exactly why they are powerful. Because spiraling thought thrives in abstraction, accumulation, and endless internal movement. Grounded action pulls the mind back into contact with reality. It reminds the system that not everything needs to be mentally carried at once. It reestablishes order by giving the mind something structured to move through instead of something imagined to keep multiplying. This is not avoidance. That distinction matters. Avoidance escapes the problem by turning away from what matters. Grounded action stabilizes the system, so the problem can be met without the mind becoming more chaotic than the problem itself. That is a very different intention. Imagine someone under work pressure. Messages are waiting, a mistake may have been made, consequences feel possible. The mind starts saying, "This is getting bad, I am losing control, everything is stacking up, I cannot manage this." If the person stays only in thought, the spiral often deepens. He tries to think his way out, but the thinking itself is now fear-shaped. It keeps exaggerating the whole field. But if he shifts into grounded behavior, something changes. He writes down the 3 actual priorities. He answers the one necessary message first. He closes the extra tabs. He names the real task. The problem may still be serious, but the mind has stopped becoming a theater of total overwhelm. That is what behavior protects. Form. A clean action protects form because it prevents the mind from remaining fully submerged in internal acceleration. It gives thought a structure to re-enter. It reduces the gap between distress and direction. It stops the mind from treating intensity as if intensity itself were progress. Many people confuse inner movement with useful response. They feel a lot happening inside and mistake that for effective engagement. But often the mind is simply burning energy without producing clarity. Action interrupts that waste. This is especially important for reflective people, overthinkers, and emotionally intense listeners. People with rich inner lives often believe that if they just think long enough, process deeply enough, or understand the feeling completely enough, they will regain control. But under pressure, more thinking can become more fuel. More processing can become more looping. More analysis can become more self-amplification. At a certain point, what protects the mind is not deeper immersion in thought, but a deliberate behavioral edge that stops thought from becoming the only environment you are living in. This is why strong minds use action wisely. They know that behavior is not only output, It is regulation. It is containment. It is a way of telling the mind, we are still capable of sequence, still capable of direction, still capable of contact with what is real. That message matters, because one of the most dangerous features of spiraling thought is helplessness. The person begins to feel that he is trapped inside a mental field he cannot organize. Action weakens that helplessness by creating movement with shape. Even a small, well-chosen behavior can restore a degree of agency, not because the whole situation is solved, but because the mind is no longer only producing pressure. It is participating in order. This leads to an important practical principle. When your thoughts start spiraling, do not ask only, "What should I think differently?" Also ask, "What is one clean action that protects the structure of my mind right now?" That question changes the posture immediately. It brings you back to sequence, back to embodiment, back to contact with reality, instead of continued surrender to internal momentum. Sometimes that action will be physical, sometimes organizational, sometimes relational. Sometimes it will simply be the next obvious task done without drama. The form can vary. The principle stays the same. A strong mind does not let thought become the only place where the moment is happening. It uses action to keep reality concrete and the self behaviorally anchored. That is not anti-intellectual. It is psychological intelligence. Because thought is powerful, but when thought has started spiraling, it often needs help from something steadier than itself. A clear action can become that help. A small behavior can hold the line. A practical movement can keep the mind from being swallowed by its own acceleration. This is one of the reasons strong minds do not break as easily as weaker ones. They do not wait for perfect clarity before acting. They often use one clean action to help restore clarity. And in pressured moments, that can make all the difference between a mind that keeps multiplying the strain and a mind that begins regaining its form. Chapter 5. How tough minds behave when life gets heavy. The first minutes of pressure are often where the whole direction of the moment gets decided. Not always visibly, but internally. That is why strong minds pay attention there. When pressure first lands, the mind becomes highly vulnerable to acceleration. Meaning speeds up, emotion rises quickly, the body tightens, attention narrows. The situation may still be unfolding, still unclear, still partly manageable, but the internal system starts behaving as if the full consequence has already arrived. This is one of the reasons people describe certain stressful moments as if they suddenly fell apart. The outer event may not have been sudden at all. What was sudden was the speed of the inner escalation. That opening window matters, because the mind is especially easy to influence there. If the first minutes are given entirely to panic, fear-loaded interpretation, emotional fusion, and automatic reaction, then the rest of the hour often becomes recovery from what the mind did to itself in those first moments. The person is no longer dealing only with the original pressure. He is dealing with pressure plus amplification, pressure plus rushed meaning, pressure plus the consequences of letting the first wave take total command. Strong minds are not immune to that first wave. That is important to say. They still feel the hit. They still register the seriousness. They still feel the body respond, the emotions surge, the thoughts begin reaching for quick conclusions. What makes them stronger is not that they never feel the opening destabilization. It is that they do not surrender the opening minutes so easily. That is where toughness becomes practical. Not in a speech about resilience. In the way the first few minutes are handled. The first principle is simple. Do not let the first wave become the final meaning. That line matters because the mind under pressure loves instant interpretation. It wants to decide quickly what this means, how bad this is, what is threatened, what future is now unfolding. But in the first minutes, the mind is often least trustworthy precisely because it is most activated. It is not seeing from full structure yet. It is seeing from surge, from urgency, from emotional compression. So one of the strongest moves a person can make is refusing to let the first interpretation become law. This is not denial. It is discipline. It is the ability to say, something difficult is happening, but I do not need to finalize its meaning in the first emotional rush. That pause is powerful, because once meaning slows, structure has a chance to re-enter. This is why the first practical job in those opening minutes is not necessarily to solve the whole problem. It is to reduce escalation. That may mean breathing once with real intention instead of breathing shallowly through panic. It may mean sitting down if the mind is starting to scatter. It may mean standing up if the body is freezing. It may mean closing unnecessary inputs, delaying reactive communication, reading the message one more time slowly, or refusing to answer the alarm inside you before you have separated fact from interpretation. None of these actions are dramatic. That is exactly why they work. They restore form before the mind has fully lost it. Then comes narrowing the field. A pressured mind wants everything at once. Every consequence, every possibility, every fear, every implication. It moves outward and forward too quickly. Strong minds interrupt that by asking a smaller, cleaner question. What is actually happening right now? Not what this might mean about the next 6 months. Not what this might reveal about your whole worth. Not what catastrophe your fear is rehearsing. What is happening now? That question protects proportion. It brings the mind back from imagined totality to present reality. And once reality is back in view, another important move becomes possible, separating layers. What is fact? What is interpretation? What is emotion? What is the next actual task? That separation is one of the clearest signs of a strong mind under stress. Weak minds blur these layers instantly. Fear sounds like fact. Urgency sounds like instruction. Overwhelm sounds like proof. A tougher mind starts pulling them apart, not because that makes the moment pleasant, but because it makes the moment usable. Imagine a person receiving criticism from someone important. In the first seconds, the mind wants to leap. This is bad, I am failing, I am exposed, this is bigger than it looks. But a stronger response begins by slowing everything down. What exactly was said? What is the real issue here? What part is feedback? What part is fear? And what actually requires response? The criticism may still sting. The consequences may still matter. But the mind has not let the first emotional wave define the total event. That is what the first minutes are for. Preserving the possibility of a cleaner response. And one of the best ways to do that is through one stabilizing action. Not many. 1. Write down the actual problem in one sentence. Take one slow breath before answering. Read the message again without adding story. Leave the room for 2 minutes instead of reacting instantly. Open the file instead of panicking about the file. Call the person if calling is the clearest next move. Do one concrete thing that keeps the mind connected to order. This matters because behavior can stabilize the first minutes in ways thought alone often cannot. The mind under pressure can become crowded very quickly. A clean action restores sequence. It tells the system, we are still capable of order. We are still capable of direction. We are not only reacting. There is another part of this that matters just as much. Do not turn the first reaction into a second problem. Many people get hit by pressure, feel the normal first surge, and then begin judging themselves for having the surge. Now there is the situation, and there is shame about the reaction to the situation. That doubles the load. Strong minds reduce this by using a more mature standard. The goal is not to feel perfect in the first 5 minutes. The goal is to keep enough structure alive that the first 5 minutes do not become total internal surrender. That is a very different standard, and it is much more useful. It allows humanity without collapse. It allows emotion without instant identity loss. It allows activation without handing activation the right to govern everything else. So when pressure first hits, the real question is not, can I be completely calm right now? It is, can I protect the opening minutes from becoming a full internal takeover? That is where mental toughness becomes real. Not after the storm has passed. At the moment where the storm first tries to take the whole sky. A sharp moment of pressure can expose the mind. A long season of pressure reveals what the mind is built to live inside. That is a different test. Many people can gather themselves for a crisis. They can respond to one hard conversation, one deadline, one emergency, one spike of uncertainty. The body activates, the mind narrows, the situation becomes intense, and for a while they can push through. But long strain is harder in a quieter way. It does not always challenge you through one dramatic moment. It challenges you through repetition, through accumulation, through the slow wearing down of emotional margin, mental spaciousness, and internal recovery. This is where real toughness is revealed. Not when you are forced to endure one extraordinary hour. When you have to remain psychologically usable across many ordinary difficult days. Long strain changes the conditions of the mind. It lowers surplus. It shortens patience. It reduces flexibility. It makes interpretation faster and recovery thinner. The person is no longer meeting each challenge from a rested center. He is meeting it from a system that already carries residue. Yesterday's stress is still in the body. Last week's uncertainty is still shaping tone. The unresolved problem is still sitting in the background, influencing mood, pace, and perception before the new demand even arrives. That is why prolonged pressure can be more dangerous than acute pressure. It does not always feel catastrophic enough to command respect, but it quietly alters baseline. And once baseline shifts, the mind becomes easier to destabilize by smaller things. A delay feels heavier than it should. A conflict lands harder than usual. A routine problem triggers a disproportionate response. The person may think, why am I reacting this strongly to something this small? But often the reaction is not really to that one moment. It is to the accumulated load the system has been carrying without enough real restoration. This is why toughness under long strain cannot be measured by intensity alone. It has to be measured by form preservation. Can you keep hierarchy? Can you keep proportion? Can you keep some behavioral order? Can you stop the season from becoming your entire identity? These questions matter more than whether you still look impressive. Because long strain tempts people into two destructive extremes. One is silent collapse. The other is overextended performance. In silent collapse, the person slowly becomes inwardly disorganized, emotionally thin, mentally crowded, and behaviorally scattered, while still trying to function on the surface. In overextended performance, he keeps forcing output as if he were in a short emergency, treating every day like a sprint, demanding the same speed and force from a system that is already overused. Both approaches ignore a central truth. Toughness in long strain is not about constant intensity. It is about sustainable structure. That requires packing. And packing is not weakness. It is psychological wisdom under load. A tough mind in a difficult season stops asking only, how do I keep going? It begins asking, how do I keep going without losing my shape? That question changes the whole posture. It turns endurance from brute force into deliberate preservation. Because when pressure lasts, the mind needs more than courage. It needs rhythm. It needs boundaries. It needs simpler internal rules. It needs fewer unnecessary decisions. It needs less interpretive drama. It needs protection from self-created chaos. This is where many people make long strain harder than it already is. They let everything remain emotionally equal. Every problem gets full volume. Every demand feels urgent. Every open loop stays mentally active. The mind carries too much at the same intensity for too long. That is not toughness. That is structural carelessness under pressure. A tougher response looks different. It protects hierarchy. Not everything matters equally today. Not everything requires immediate emotional investment. Not everything deserves rehearsal all day long. A strong mind under long strain keeps sorting. What must be handled now? What is real but not immediate? What is heavy but not helped by being mentally replayed for 6 more hours? What is essential, and what is noise made louder by accumulated fatigue? That sorting preserves form. So does simplification. When life is already demanding, avoidable complexity becomes expensive. Too many decisions, too many inputs, too many unresolved small frictions, too much disorder in the environment, too much emotional exposure without recovery. A strong mind in prolonged pressure does not always become more ambitious. Often it becomes cleaner, clearer routines, fewer negotiations, more settled defaults, less internal clutter. More respect for the fact that under load, even small structural failures cost more than usual. This is also where many people must release the fantasy of peak functioning. During long strain, a mature mind stops measuring itself against its easiest season. It stops saying, "Why can't I perform like I do when life is light?" That comparison quietly destroys dignity. It turns contextual reduction in capacity into personal failure. Real toughness does not require pretending your margin has not changed. It requires protecting your core structure even when your margin has changed. That might mean fewer but cleaner actions, smaller but non-negotiable standards, more recovery that is strategic rather than indulgent, more honesty about what pressure is doing to the system before the system starts lying to you through irritability, scattered thought, numb scrolling, emotional thinning, or private resentment. Because one of the most dangerous effects of long strain is normalization. The person gets used to living slightly compressed, slightly activated, slightly more reactive than normal, slightly more crowded inside. After enough time, the distortion starts feeling ordinary. That is why toughness requires periodic return to perspective. The mind has to be reminded that pressure is something it is carrying, not something it must become. That distinction is crucial. You are in a hard season. You are not the season. You are carrying strain. You do not have to turn strain into identity. Strong minds protect that line carefully, because once the season becomes the whole self, collapse becomes much easier. The person starts thinking from inside depletion as though depletion were truth. He starts speaking from fatigue as though fatigue were character. He starts relating to himself as if the pressure-defined version is the real version. That is where prolonged difficulty becomes psychologically dangerous. So real toughness in long strain is not loud. It does not always look heroic. Often it looks like protecting sleep more seriously, reducing unnecessary noise, refusing to emotionally rehearse the same problem all day, keeping 1 or 2 essential behaviors alive, protecting the order of what matters, creating small recovery points before the mind becomes unusable, returning to structure before fatigue starts rewriting meaning. These are not glamorous acts. They are enduring acts. And endurance with structure is what keeps prolonged pressure from dissolving the mind into chronic reactivity. So when life becomes heavy for longer than you wanted, do not ask only whether you are still surviving it. Ask whether you are still keeping form inside it. Because that is where real toughness is revealed. Not in one moment of force. In the sustained discipline of not letting a hard season slowly become the architecture of your whole mind. One difficult moment is never only one difficult moment if the mind turns it into a definition. That is where many people quietly lose more ground than they need to. Not in the pressure itself. in what they decide the pressure meant about who they are. A hard response under strain can be painful. You lose perspective. You react too fast. You freeze, spiral, shut down, speak badly, think badly, abandon structure, or become someone you do not respect for an hour, a day, or a week. All of that matters. It should be taken seriously. But the most dangerous part often begins after the moment has already passed, when the mind starts telling a larger story. Here we go again. This is what I'm really like under pressure. I haven't changed. I still break when it matters. That story is costly. Because once a pressured reaction becomes a self-definition, recovery becomes much harder. The person is no longer just returning from one destabilized moment. He is now trying to return from an identity wound. He is not only repairing behavior, he is carrying shame, distrust, disappointment, and the feeling that the hard moment exposed something final about him. And that is exactly how fragility becomes stronger than it needs to become. This is why strong minds recover differently. Not perfectly, but intelligently. They do not pretend the bad moment never happened. They do not excuse it away. They do not call weakness strength or collapse resilience. But they also do not allow one pressured reaction to become the whole truth of identity. They know that if recovery is too slow, too dramatic, or too soaked in self-condemnation, the original difficulty will keep teaching the mind the wrong lesson. That lesson sounds like this. When pressure hits, I do not just struggle. I become someone weak. And once the mind learns that lesson deeply enough, future pressure becomes heavier before it even arrives. The person starts bracing against himself. He enters difficult moments carrying memory, anticipation, and a silent fear of what his own mind may become. That is one of the hidden ways fragility grows. It is not only caused by stressful moments. It is reinforced by what the person keeps deciding those moments reveal about him. So strong minds interrupt that process early. They recover before fragility becomes identity. That recovery begins with specificity. A tough mind does not say, I'm a mess. It says, I lost form there. It does not say, I always fall apart. It says, under that kind of pressure, this pattern still activates too quickly. It does not say, this proves I'm weak. It says, this shows me exactly what still needs training. That difference is not cosmetic. It is structural. Specific language protects dignity because it keeps the mind from collapsing the whole self into one pressured reaction. It allows honesty without self-destruction. It lets the person see the failure clearly while keeping the interpretation narrow enough to remain useful. This matters because shame is imprecise. Shame always speaks in identity language. It says always, never, everyone, everything, this is who you are, this is what you become, this is what the moment proves. Strong minds learn to distrust that tone, not because they are unwilling to admit mistakes, but because they know shame does not clarify structure. It darkens it. It makes one event feel total. It makes one bad response sound permanent. It turns correction into condemnation. Real recovery does not work like that. Real recovery asks better questions. What exactly happened? Where did I lose form? What part was pressure? What part was my interpretation? What pattern took over? What restores structure now? These questions are not soft. They are serious, but they keep seriousness from mutating into self-attack. That is one of the deepest differences between a fragile mind and a stronger one. A fragile mind uses bad moments to reduce its own internal credibility. A stronger mind uses bad moments to gather better diagnostic information. Then comes return. This part is essential because recovery is not complete when insight appears. It becomes real when structure is re-entered. The person must do something that reconnects him to form before the mind turns the whole event into a private mythology. That may mean repairing a conversation, completing one delayed task, re-establishing a routine, taking one grounded action, getting needed sleep, clarifying the actual problem, or returning to a standard that pressure temporarily interrupted. The action may be small. The timing matters more. The longer the mind stays in identity interpretation, the more expensive the recovery becomes. That is why strong minds recover before fragility becomes identity. They do not wait until they feel pure again. They do not wait until the shame disappears completely. They do not wait for a dramatic inner reset. They return while some discomfort is still present. They re-enter structure before the story hardens. This is one of the most overlooked forms of mental toughness. People think toughness means never stumbling. It does not. Often toughness means refusing to let the stumble become a self-concept. A strong mind understands that one bad hour does not deserve a lifetime sentence. One pressured reaction can be real, serious, embarrassing, regrettable, and still not be the deepest truth about the person who had it. That truth has to be protected, especially after failure, because pressure is most dangerous when it gains the power to rewrite identity. Imagine someone who speaks badly in a hard conversation after weeks of strain. A weaker recovery turns it into a character verdict. I ruin things when pressure gets high. This is who I am when it matters. A stronger recovery still admits the failure, but it interprets it differently. I was overloaded. I lost form. I spoke from activation instead of structure. That has to be repaired, and that pattern has to be trained. But this is not the whole truth of me. The outer event may be the same. The future shaped by each interpretation is not. That is the point. Recovery is not only about returning to calm. It is about protecting what your mind will believe about itself after the difficult moment. Because whatever your mind repeatedly believes about itself under pressure will begin influencing the next moment of pressure long before it arrives. If every bad response becomes evidence of weakness, then weakness starts becoming expected. If pressured reactions are treated as patterns to train rather than identities to worship, then the mind remains more open to growth, more willing to trust effort, and less likely to carry fragility forward as destiny. This is why strong minds are not merely good at enduring pressure. They are good at metabolizing pressure. They know how to turn a bad moment into instruction instead of identity. They know how to recover with dignity instead of drama. They know how to be honest without becoming psychologically cruel. That kind of recovery is powerful because it keeps the mind from becoming smaller each time life becomes difficult. It allows correction without collapse of self-respect. It keeps the person from handing one hard moment the right to define the whole architecture of his mind. So when pressure shakes you, remember this. The moment matters, but the meaning you attach to the moment matters just as much. You are allowed to admit where you lost form. You are allowed to take the mistake seriously. You are allowed to see the pattern clearly. But do not let a bad moment become your identity before you have even begun to recover from it. That is not honesty. That is fragility trying to become permanent. And mental toughness, in one of its quietest forms, is the refusal to let that happen. Chapter 6. Becoming someone whose mind can be trusted. Most people first become interested in mental toughness because they want to handle life better. They want to stop folding under stress, stop overreacting, stop spiraling, freezing, shutting down, or losing themselves the moment pressure rises past a certain point. They want to think more clearly, stay more contained, and respond with more steadiness when life becomes heavy. That is a worthy reason to begin. But if you stay with this work long enough, something deeper happens. You do not only change how you perform under pressure. You change how it feels to be you. That shift is easy to overlook because it is quieter than visible success. It does not always arrive with an obvious milestone. Sometimes it appears in small, private moments. You notice that stress rises and your mind does not become a full emergency as quickly as it once did. You notice that a difficult conversation no longer makes you feel internally homeless for the rest of the day. You notice that uncertainty still affects you, but it does not instantly turn your whole inner world into noise. Something has changed in the lived atmosphere of the self, and that matters more than many people realize. Because one of the hardest things about a fragile mind is not only what happens in the pressured moment, it is what life inside that mind begins to feel like over time. A person who repeatedly breaks under strain does not only suffer external difficulty, he starts losing trust in his own internal environment. He becomes wary of his own reactions. He anticipates his own spirals. He braces against his own mind before the next hard thing even arrives. He is not only dealing with pressure from the world, he is dealing with the fear that his own inner structure may not hold when the world presses harder than usual. That is exhausting in a very particular way. It makes the self feel less like a home and more like a place that can be taken over too easily. This is the hidden reward of mental toughness. It does not only improve outcomes, it makes your inner world more inhabitable. That word matters. Inhabitable. Because many people live inside minds that feel too crowded, too reactive, too easy to flood. Their thoughts rush each other. Their emotions take over too quickly. Their interpretations darken too fast. Their nervous system keeps putting the whole self on alert. Even when life is outwardly manageable, inwardly there is very little spaciousness. The person may still function. He may still look capable, but inside he feels compressed. He feels one difficult moment away from becoming someone smaller, louder, and less trustworthy than he wants to be. Mental toughness begins changing that. Not by making you emotionless, not by making life easy, by making you less internally easy to overrun. That is a profound change. Because once the mind becomes stronger, life does not stop containing pressure, disappointment, conflict, uncertainty, exposure, or fatigue. But the inner experience of meeting those things becomes different. There is more room before conclusion, more room before panic, more room before identity starts getting rewritten by the moment. The self becomes a place where difficulty can land without instantly turning into total disorganization. That creates a new kind of relief. Not the relief of never being challenged. The relief of no longer fearing your own mind quite as much when challenge comes. That may be one of the deepest things strong minds gain. Not dominance, not performance, a different relationship with themselves. A person with more mental toughness still feels, still gets tired, still has hard days, painful reactions, moments of uncertainty, stretches of emotional heaviness. But he does not experience all of those states as immediate threats to his structure. He does not assume every intense feeling is the beginning of collapse. He does not let every pressured moment become a referendum on who he is. He carries more inner shape into his experience. That shape changes the whole feel of daily life. He thinks with more room. He feels with more containment. He returns faster after disruption. He becomes less dependent on ideal conditions in order to feel mentally usable. That last point is important. Many fragile minds are not only reactive, they are conditional. They need things to feel sufficiently clear, calm, or manageable before they can access their better structure. Mental toughness changes that by making the self more available under imperfect conditions. You begin to realize that you do not need a perfect emotional climate to remain yourself. You do not need everything to be easy before clarity becomes possible. You do not need complete certainty before proportion can return. That is inner freedom, and it changes everyday existence. A stronger mind also changes how you relate to your own emotions. You stop treating every surge as an enemy or as a ruler. Fear becomes something you can feel without instantly obeying. Stress becomes something you can notice without immediately dramatizing. Sadness becomes something you can carry without assuming it has the right to define the whole day. The result is not emotional flatness. It is emotional livability. Your inner life becomes less hostile, less theatrical, less prone to turning every state into a full system event. That is why mental toughness is not merely a performance advantage. It is a quality of life advantage. It changes the climate of being alive inside your own skin. Many people do not have language for this. They think they want more resilience because they want to succeed more, produce more, handle more, or impress themselves more. But underneath that, many of them want something quieter and more human. They want to stop feeling so easy to disturb from the inside. They want to stop living with the constant suspicion that when life gets serious, their mind may become a bad place to stand. They want to feel less split, less overrun, less internally unstable. Mental toughness begins delivering that. Through repetition, through retained form, through evidence. Each time you slow your meaning under pressure, something in you becomes more livable. Each time you contain a state instead of becoming it, something in you becomes more livable. Each time you recover from strain without turning it into identity, something in you becomes more livable. The mind starts learning that difficulty does not automatically mean self-loss. And once that learning deepens, the self begins feeling different from the inside. Less crowded, less alarming, less easy to fracture, more breathable, more solid, more trustworthy. This is one of the reasons real mental toughness feels calmer than people expect. It is not usually loud. It does not need to prove itself all the time. It often shows up as a quieter internal life. Less noise around ordinary stress, less self-attack after imperfect moments, less emotional flooding around things that once would have become total. Strong minds are not always more dramatic in how they handle life. They are often less dramatic, precisely because their inner world no longer turns every pressure into a complete internal event. That changes self-respect too, because it is difficult to deeply respect a self you do not trust under load. But when the mind becomes more stable, self-respect starts becoming less theoretical. You no longer admire strength only in the abstract. You begin experiencing yourself as someone who can stay more intact when it matters. That does not make you perfect. It makes you believable to yourself. And being believable to yourself is one of the deepest forms of inner peace. So when we talk about mental toughness, we are talking about more than stress tolerance. We are talking about the gradual transformation of inner life itself. We are talking about what happens when the mind stops becoming such an easy amplifier of pressure. We are talking about what happens when your thoughts become less dangerous to live inside during difficult moments. We are talking about what happens when the self begins feeling less like a fragile arrangement and more like a structure. That is why this matters so much. A strong mind does not only help you survive pressure in the world, it changes the quality of your existence within yourself. And for many people, that is not just useful. It is healing. Most people think confidence is a feeling, a high state, a strong mood, a temporary sense of certainty that arrives when things are going well, when energy is high, when recent evidence has been favorable enough to make the self feel persuasive again. And there is some truth in that. Confidence does often feel emotional in the moment. But if that is all confidence is, then it will always remain unstable. It will rise when life is smooth and thin out when life becomes demanding. It will sound convincing in calm conditions and disappear precisely when it is needed most. That is not the deepest form of confidence. Real confidence grows when the mind stops repeatedly abandoning itself under pressure. That is a quieter truth, but a much stronger one. Because underneath a lot of low confidence is not a lack of talent, intelligence, or potential. Underneath it is damaged internal trust. A person has seen his own mind turn against him too many times. He has watched pressure rush meaning, watched fear become reality, watched one hard moment become total internal disorder. He has felt himself lose proportion, lose structure, lose clarity, and then had to live with the aftertaste of that. So even when he speaks confidently on good days, another part of him remains unconvinced. It remembers. It has evidence of how easily the system can abandon itself when life becomes heavy. That is why confidence often feels more fragile than people want to admit. It is being built on language without enough structure. A person tells himself to believe more, think bigger, stop doubting, trust the process, be stronger. But confidence does not grow mainly because the mind says prettier things to itself. It grows because the mind begins behaving in ways that make self-trust more rational. It grows when, under stress, the system stops repeatedly proving that pressure can make it betray its own form. This is the shift. Confidence deepens when the mind becomes more loyal to itself in difficulty. Loyal not in a sentimental sense, in a structural sense. The mind learns how to stay with proportion when fear rises. It learns how to stay with reality when urgency wants to dramatize it. It learns how to stay with standards when emotion wants to renegotiate them. It learns how to stay with behavior when internal noise would prefer collapse, delay, or escape. Each time that happens, something important is restored. The person becomes more believable to himself. And believability is what quiet confidence is made of. A person with shallow confidence needs constant emotional support. He needs momentum, reassurance, progress, praise, or control over conditions in order to feel persuasive inside himself. But a person whose mind has stopped abandoning itself as easily does not need quite as much help from circumstance. He is not confident because every day feels good. He is more confident because difficult days no longer erase him in the same way. Pressure still affects him, but it does not rewrite him so completely. That difference changes the whole tone of inner life. He trusts himself differently, not theatrically, not in an inflated way, just more deeply. He begins to know something through repeated experience. When life becomes demanding, my mind may shake, but it is less likely to desert me entirely. It is less likely to hand itself over to panic, distortion, and self-loss without resistance. That knowledge is one of the strongest sources of confidence a human being can build because it is not rooted in fantasy. It is rooted in evidence. And evidence matters. A fragile mind can speak in bold language and still remain unconvinced underneath. A stronger mind may speak more quietly but trust itself more. That is why real confidence often looks less dramatic than insecurity imagines it should look. It is not always loud. It does not always announce itself. It often appears as steadiness, as less inner flinching when pressure arrives, as less need to prove strength outwardly, because some part of the self already knows there is more structure present inwardly. That is what makes confidence durable. It is no longer being asked to survive on inspiration alone. It is being supported by internal history. The history of slowing meaning instead of rushing it. The history of containing a state instead of becoming it. The history of returning to form after difficult moments. The history of not letting one hard day become a total self-definition. All of these moments matter because confidence is not built only in victory. It is built in the growing trust that your mind can remain more intact in difficulty than it once could. That trust changes how a person enters future pressure. He is less anticipatorily afraid of himself, less likely to treat challenge as the beginning of internal betrayal, less dependent on perfect emotional conditions before he can access his better structure. This is what many people actually want when they say they want confidence. They do not only want to feel impressive. They want to stop feeling so internally easy to shake. They want to know that when things become serious, their own mind will not instantly become a second enemy inside the situation. They want a kind of self-trust that does not vanish the moment stakes rise. Mental toughness creates that kind of confidence because it reduces self-betrayal at the level where it matters most, not in image, in structure. The mind becomes less likely to exaggerate what is happening. less likely to fuse with every emotional surge, less likely to give the loudest state total authority. And once that starts becoming true, confidence no longer has to be forced. It starts deepening naturally because the self is becoming less contradictory to itself under stress. This does not mean the person becomes fearless. It means fear stops being the ruler of confidence. It does not mean he never doubts. It means doubt no longer empties the whole system of its strength. It does not mean he walks into every challenge with emotional certainty. It means he walks into challenge with more evidence that even uncertainty does not automatically make him lose himself. That is a different kind of confidence, a quieter kind, a more adult kind. Not confidence as performance, confidence as trust earned inside pressure. And that is why it lasts longer, because feelings come and go, moods change, circumstances shift, outcomes remain partly out of your control, but a mind that has stopped abandoning itself so easily carries something stronger than a high state. It carries internal credibility. It knows through lived proof that pressure may still arrive, fear may still rise, and strain may still hurt, but the whole structure does not have to disappear just because difficulty entered the room. That knowledge settles a person. It reduces the need for constant external reassurance. It reduces the panic beneath challenge. It reduces the secret dread of one's own inner instability. And in that settling, confidence deepens. Not because the person has become invulnerable, because the mind has become less likely to turn vulnerability into total collapse. That is the confidence strong minds build. Not confidence that says, "Nothing can touch me." Confidence that says, "When something touches me, I am becoming someone who is less likely to lose himself in it." At the end of all this, the standard becomes very simple. Not easy, but simple. When pressure arrives, hold form. That is the rule strong minds live by. Not because they never feel fear, not because stress stops affecting them, not because life becomes gentle enough to make steadiness effortless. Pressure still comes, deadlines still compress time, conflict still sharpens emotion, uncertainty still activates the imagination, loss still hurts, exposure still unsettles, fatigue still lowers margin. None of that disappears just because someone becomes mentally tougher. What changes is what pressure is allowed to do inside the mind. For a long time, many people live by a different rule without realizing it. When pressure arrives, speed up. When pressure arrives, let urgency take command. When pressure arrives, let emotion decide what everything means. When pressure arrives, abandon structure and hope to recover later. That may not be a conscious philosophy, but repeated fragility teaches it anyway. The mind begins learning that pressure is the moment when inner order becomes optional. That is the rule that must be replaced. Because if pressure always has the right to rearrange you, then your mind will never feel fully trustworthy. Every hard moment will carry a second danger inside it. Not only the event itself, but what your own system may do to the event. The pressure becomes heavier because you are not only carrying life, you are carrying the fear that life will quickly become mental disorganization. This is why the new standard matters so much. It is not built around avoiding pressure. It is built around preserving form inside pressure. That phrase matters. Hold form. Hold interpretation long enough that fear does not become fact too quickly. Hold emotional containment long enough that activation does not become identity. Hold behavior long enough that the mind does not disappear into pure reaction. Hold proportion long enough that one difficult moment does not become the whole truth of reality. Hold posture long enough that discomfort does not automatically become surrender. This is not perfection. It is structure. And structure is what gives a pressured mind dignity. Because pressure has a way of shrinking people inwardly when no counterstandard exists. It makes the mind smaller, louder, more immediate, more total. It narrows perspective and floods meaning. It pushes everything toward urgency, dramatization, and internal compression. If there is no stronger rule already in place, the mind kneels to the moment. It treats intensity as if intensity itself were authority. Holding form interrupts that. It says, pressure may enter, but it does not get full command. Fear may be here, but fear does not become the only voice. Urgency may be here, but urgency does not erase sequence. Emotion may be here, but emotion does not rewrite identity. Difficulty may be here, but difficulty does not dissolve my structure. That is what mental toughness finally comes down to. Not becoming untouchable, becoming less available to internal collapse. And once that becomes the standard, many things begin organizing themselves differently. You stop measuring success only by whether you felt calm. Calm may come or not come. You stop measuring strength only by whether you looked unaffected. You may be deeply affected and still remain in form. You stop expecting every pressured moment to feel clean. Some moments will still be messy, heavy, and intense. But the question becomes steadier than all of that. Did I hold enough form to remain in relationship with clarity, proportion, and direction? That is a far wiser measurement, because it makes mental toughness practical. It turns strength from an abstract ideal into a trainable standard. It gives you something real to return to when life becomes demanding. Not be perfect, not never shake, not always feel strong. Just this: hold form. Sometimes that will mean slowing meaning before reacting. Sometimes it will mean containing a state without becoming it. Sometimes it will mean using one deliberate action to stop the mind from spiraling. Sometimes it will mean protecting hierarchy during long strain. Sometimes it will mean recovering from a difficult moment before fragility becomes identity. The expression changes. The principle stays the same. Pressure is no longer allowed to turn your mind into a place with no structure. That does not mean every pressured moment will go well. It means every pressured moment becomes part of the same deeper training. You are teaching the mind repeatedly that difficulty does not equal disorganization, that intensity does not equal command, that strain does not equal collapse, that being affected does not equal being lost. And over time, these teachings accumulate. This is how identity changes quietly. Not through one dramatic breakthrough, but through repeated moments where pressure arrives and you do not surrender the whole field. You still feel the force of the moment. You still register the seriousness, but something inside remains more upright than before, more guided than before, more deliberate than before. The old collapse pathway may still whisper, but it no longer runs the whole system so easily. That is where quiet confidence is born. Not from saying, I can handle anything, but from knowing, when pressure comes, I am becoming someone who can hold more form than I once could. That knowledge changes the way you live. It makes you less afraid of your own mind, less dependent on ideal circumstances, less vulnerable to every internal fluctuation, less likely to interpret difficulty as the end of your structure. And maybe that is the deepest relief of all. Not that life becomes light, but that you stop feeling so internally easy to shake when it becomes heavy. So let this be the standard you carry forward. When pressure arrives, I do not need to become extraordinary. I need to remain in form. When emotion rises, I do not need to become numb. I need to remain in form. When uncertainty stretches on, I do not need perfect certainty before I respond well. I need to remain in form. When the first signs of collapse begin, I do not need self-condemnation. I need to return to form. That is the mature rule. That is the usable rule. That is the rule that turns mental toughness from inspiration into architecture. Because in the end, a strong mind is not one that never feels pressure. It is one that has learned, gradually and honestly, how to keep its shape when pressure presses hard against it. And that is enough to change a life. Not loudly, not theatrically, but from the inside out. Pressure will still visit you. Some seasons will still be demanding. Some moments will still be painful. Some situations will still test the structure you have built. But now the test is no longer meaningless. Now you know what you are practicing. You are practicing form. You are practicing retained structure. You are practicing the quiet art of not letting a difficult moment become the ruler of your whole mind. That art will not make you less human. It will make you more inhabitable to yourself, more trustworthy under strain, more able to carry life without becoming inwardly chaotic each time it asks more from you. That is real mental toughness, not a performance, a posture, not a feeling, a structure, not a temporary mood, a way of standing inside pressure that allows difficulty to remain difficulty without turning it into internal collapse. So when life presses again, and it will, remember the simplest version of everything this journey has been building toward. Do not let pressure take your form. Feel what is real. Face what is real. Respond to what is real. But hold form. Hold it imperfectly if you must. Hold it quietly if you must. Hold it with shaking hands if you must. But hold it, because every time you do, you teach your mind the same life-changing truth. Pressure may arrive, but breaking is no longer the only way you know how to meet it.